You think the biggest threat to a cowboy in the Wild West was a high-noon duel or a stray bullet from a bank robbery. But the deadliest thing in the saloon wasn't in a holster, it was in the shot glass. They had mastered techniques for turning industrial waste into whiskey that would make modern health inspectors scream in terror. Here is the thing about Wild West liquor that sounds completely backwards. Drinking the pure stuff was considered weak, while downing a glass of chemical sludge laced with actual poison was the mark of a real man. Yeah, you heard that right. The whiskey served in those swinging door saloons was literally a chemical weapon disguised as a drink. Taking even a few shots of what they called Tarantula Juice or Coffin Varnish didn't just make you drunk. It made your body fight for survival against neurotoxins and corrosives. You see, the iconic amber liquid you see in movies wasn't aged in oak barrels for years. In many cases, it was raw alcohol, mixed with things you wouldn't use to clean your toilet, let alone put in your mouth. The chemical content of this frontier booze was often closer to paint stripper than anything you'd find on a liquor store shelf today. When you drink it, your body doesn't just process alcohol, it panics. It tries to filter out alkaloids like strychnine and nicotine that are attacking your nervous system directly. You end up not just intoxicated, but in a state of delirious poisoning that cowboys mistook for a good time. It's like trying to relax by drinking a cocktail of gasoline and pesticide. Cowboys figured this out the hard way during those long, dusty cattle drives. The logistics of the frontier were brutal. Transporting heavy oak barrels filled with high-quality Kentucky bourbon across thousands of miles of rugged terrain, hostile territory, and scorching heat was a logistical nightmare. Wagons were slow, space was limited, and glass bottles broke easily. By the time a barrel of decent whiskey reached a remote mining camp or a dusty cattle town, its price had skyrocketed beyond what any normal working man could afford. So, the saloon keepers faced a dilemma. They had thirsty men arriving with money in their pockets, expecting a burn in their throats, but the supply of real whiskey was scarce and expensive. The solution? Capitalist alchemy. Most saloon owners became amateur chemists, but not the Walter White kind, more like the mad scientist who doesn't care if you go blind kind. They would take one barrel of actual grain alcohol, or neutral spirits, shipped from industrial cities, and stretch it into 4 or 5 barrels of product. This meant diluting the alcohol with massive amounts of river water. But here is the problem. When you water down whiskey by 80%, it doesn't look like whiskey, it doesn't smell like whiskey, and most importantly, it doesn't kick like whiskey. It tastes like dirty water. And if a cowboy paid for a drink and got dirty water, he didn't just leave a bad Yelp review. He usually dismantled the bar and the bartender with his fists or his Colt 45. Saloon keepers had to get creative fast. They needed to fake the sensory experience of drinking hard liquor using whatever cheap ingredients they had lying around the frontier. Their first instinct? Restore the burn. Real high-proof alcohol stings the throat and warms the belly. Water does not. So, to simulate that high-proof heat in a watered-down drink, they turned to the spice rack. Cayenne pepper. They would dump handfuls of cayenne pepper or red pepper into the barrel. When a cowboy tossed back a shot, his throat would scream in protest. The capsaicin in the pepper tricked the pain receptors in the esophagus into thinking they were being hit by strong ethanol. The cowboy would gasp, wipe a tear from his eye, and slam the glass down, convinced he was drinking the strong stuff. It was a perfect illusion, pain as a proxy for quality. But the burn was just the beginning of the deception. Next, they had to fix the color. Real whiskey gets its beautiful amber hue from years of sitting in charred oak barrels, absorbing tannins and wood sugars. The watered-down swill in the saloon looked like cloudy dishwater. Since they couldn't wait 5 years for nature to do its job, they looked for a shortcut. The most common coloring agent on the frontier? Chewing tobacco, and not just fresh tobacco. We are talking about plug tobacco, often cheap and nasty. Saloon keepers would toss huge plugs of tobacco into the barrel to steep, like the world's most carcinogenic tea bag. Within days, the nicotine and tar would leach out, turning the clear liquid into a convincing, dark brown whiskey color. But the tobacco did something else, something much more sinister than just changing the color. The massive amounts of nicotine dissolved in the alcohol acted as a potent stimulant and a poison. When a cowboy drank this tobacco whiskey, he wasn't just getting drunk. He was getting a massive, spinning nicotine buzz that made his head swim and his stomach churn. It mimicked the sensation of being incredibly intoxicated. The nausea, the dizziness, the shakes. To an uneducated drinker, these were signs that the liquor was powerful. In reality, they were symptoms of acute nicotine poisoning. But wait, it gets significantly worse. The cowboys of the Wild West were tough men who lived hard lives. They built up tolerances. Sometimes pepper and tobacco weren't enough to give them the kick they craved. They wanted a drink that would make them feel invincible, wild, and dangerous. To satisfy this demand, some unscrupulous distillers turned to a literal poison, strychnine. Yes, strychnine. The stuff used to kill rats and wolves. In small doses, strychnine acts as a stimulant to the nervous system. It heightens senses, causes muscle twitching, and creates a feeling of intense, wired energy. Saloon keepers discovered that adding a pinch of strychnine to their weak whiskey produced a distinct physiological reaction. The drinker would feel a sudden jolt, a tightening of the jaw, a rush of aggression. This explains the mean drunk trope of the Wild West better than psychology does. These men weren't just drunk. They were chemically induced into a state of hyper-aggressive toxicity. The strychnine blocked the inhibitory neurotransmitters in their brains, making them twitchy, paranoid, and ready to fight. A saloon brawl wasn't just a result of bad temper. It was often a side effect of the neurotoxins floating in their glasses. Then there was the flavor problem. Neutral spirits don't taste like corn or rye. They taste like medical cleaner. To mask this, and to add the earthy notes found in real whiskey, distillers used ingredients that belong in a hardware store, not a kitchen. Turpentine. Distilled from pine resin, turpentine is a solvent used for thinning oil-based paints. They would add turpentine to give the drink a woody flavor profile that vaguely resembled the pine oak notes of barrel aging. It also added a volatile chemical smell that cleared the sinuses, convincing the drinker that the alcohol content was high. In reality, the turpentine was slowly dissolving the fats in their kidneys and liver, causing rot gut in the most literal sense. The term wasn't a metaphor. Their insides were literally rotting from solvent abuse. But the chemistry set didn't stop there. Real high-proof whiskey holds a bead. If you shake a bottle of strong liquor, bubbles form and hang there for a moment. Watered-down liquor bubbles disappear instantly. Sharp-eyed cowboys used the bead test to check quality. To fool them, bartenders added soap. That's right. A bar of soap tossed into the barrel would dissolve, adding surfactants to the mix. When the bottle was shaken, the soap created a lasting foam or bead that mimicked the surface tension of high-proof alcohol. Sometimes, if they were feeling fancy, they used ammonia instead. So your whiskey was a cocktail of water, pepper, tobacco juice, rat poison, paint thinner, and laundry soap. The irony was brutal. Cowboys spent their lives fearing rattlesnakes on the trail, only to pay good money to drink snakehead whiskey. Some legends and some historical accounts suggest that in the most desperate or gimmicky saloons, actual rattlesnake heads were dropped into the barrel. Whether for flavor, doubtful, or pure marketing machismo, it reinforced the idea that you had to be tough to survive the drink. But here is where the psychology of the Wild West gets truly bizarre. You might think cowboys would be outraged if they found out. And sure, if they caught a bartender adding water, there would be a hanging. But the additives? Many of them actually preferred the adulterated stuff. It hit harder, it burned more, it made them feel crazier. There are records of frontiersmen complaining when they were served actual, pure, high-quality French brandy or fine bourbon because it was too smooth. To a throat scarred by turpentine and cayenne, a smooth drink felt like water. They thought they were being ripped off if their eyes didn't water, and their stomach didn't cramp. They had conditioned themselves to associate pain with pleasure and toxicity with potency. This creates a terrifying picture of social life in the 1870s. Imagine a room full of armed men, exhausted from months of labor, drinking a mixture of stimulants, strychnine, depressants, alcohol, and hallucinogens, tobacco, wormwood sometimes. It was a chemical powder keg waiting for a spark. The violence of the Old West makes a lot more sense when you realize half the population was suffering from low-grade chemical psychosis. The Gunpowder Test is a famous piece of folklore that actually has roots in this era. To prove the whiskey was strong and not just pepper water, a cowboy might pour a bit of the liquor over a small pile of gunpowder and try to light it. If the wet powder didn't light, the booze was too watery. Scam. If it flared up with a bright yellow flash, it contained too much fusel oil or dangerous additives. Poison. But if it burned with a steady blue flame, that was the sweet spot. It meant the alcohol content was high enough to sustain combustion, but clean enough not to explode. It was rudimentary chemistry performed by guys who often couldn't read their own names. But let's talk about the specific biological horror of fusel oils. In the rush to distill spirits on the frontier, moonshiners often didn't separate the heads and tails of the distillate from the hearts. The heads contain methanol and acetone. Methanol attacks the optic nerve. This is where the term blind drunk takes on a dark, literal meaning. It wasn't just a figure of speech. Cowboys drinking poorly distilled frontier whiskey literally risked going temporarily or permanently blind as the methanol metabolized into formic acid in their bodies, destroying their retinas. You could walk into a saloon seeing the world in Technicolor and crawl out seeing nothing but shadows. And then there was Jake Leg. While this specific term became famous later during Prohibition, the precursors existed in the Wild West. Adulterants used to stretch whiskey, sometimes contained organophosphates or other industrial chemicals that attacked the motor nerves in the legs. Cowboys would develop a peculiar, slapping gait, unable to lift their feet properly because the nerves controlling their lower limbs were dying. They would drag their boots across the floorboards, victims of the very drink they used to numb the pain of the trail. The saloon floor was a parade of neurological damage. The names given to these drinks were warning labels in themselves. They didn't call it Old Smooth and Tasty. They called it Tarantula Juice, implying it would make you dance like you were bitten by a spider. They called it Coffin Varnish, acknowledging it was polishing your insides for the grave. They called it Red Eye, not because of the color, but because your eyes would look like road maps of hell the next morning. The most successful rectifiers, the polite legal term for companies that blended and adulterated spirits, were essentially running massive fraud operations. They would buy high wines, raw, harsh spirit, distilled at high proof, and rectify it with prune juice for body, iodine for that medicinal bite, and even sulfuric acid to give it a dry finish. Sulfuric acid. Let that sink in. The same acid used in car batteries was used to tweak the flavor profile of a drink served to human beings. It gave the liquor a sharp, crisp finish that cut through the sweetness of the molasses or burnt sugar used to hide the rot. It also slowly eroded the enamel off their teeth and inflamed their stomach linings. These practices were so widespread that by the late 1800s, the American government realized they had a crisis on their hands. It wasn't just about taxes. It was about public health. The Cowboys were poisoning themselves faster than the Indian Wars or influenza could kill them. This led to the Bottled-in Bond Act of 1897. This was one of the first consumer protection laws in U.S. history. It set a standard. Whiskey had to be the product of one distillation season, by one distiller, at one distillery, and aged in a federally bonded warehouse under U.S. government supervision for at least 4 years and bottled at 100 proof. It was essentially a government seal that said, "This bottle contains actual alcohol and wood, not tobacco spit and gun cleaner." But for the rugged men of the frontier, this government whiskey was often viewed with suspicion. It was too expensive, too hard to find, and frankly, too boring. The legacy of this toxic era is still with us. Have you ever wondered why we describe strong liquor as having a kick, or why we value the burn? That's a cultural hangover from the days when the burn was the only way to know you weren't drinking pond water. We have romanticized the toughness of the cowboy, but we forget that their toughness was partly a biological resistance to industrial toxins. Even the way they drank, tossing it back in a single gulp, was a survival mechanism. You didn't sip Tarantula Juice. You didn't swirl it and sniff the bouquet because the bouquet smelled like a freshly painted fence. You threw it past your tongue and straight into your stomach to minimize the chemical burns on your taste buds. The weirdest part? Some of these ingredients are actually making a comeback, albeit in safer forms. Craft distillers are experimenting with smoked grains, tobacco notes, and spicy finishes, pepper notes. But they are doing it for flavor, using safe methods. The Cowboys were doing it for survival and profit, using ingredients that would land a modern bartender in prison for attempted murder. Think about the pickled cowboy. That wasn't just a metaphor for being drunk. With the amount of alcohol, formaldehyde, sometimes generated from poor distillation, and turpentine in their systems, they were literally preserving their own tissues while they were still alive. There are stories of undertakers in the Wild West joking that they didn't need to embalm the town drunks because they were already 80% preserved by the time they died. The Coffin Varnish had done the job for them, turning their livers into leather and their veins into preserved specimens. So, the next time you see a movie where a cowboy walks into a saloon, slams a silver dollar on the bar, and whispers, "Whiskey," don't imagine a smooth, oaky vanilla delight. Imagine a cup of brown river water, spiked with chewing tobacco, seasoned with chili powder, and topped off with a splash of paint thinner. Imagine him drinking it, grimacing and feeling the strychnine tighten his muscles for the fight ahead. He wasn't enjoying a beverage. He was fueling a chemical fire inside his own body. And if he was still standing the next morning, it wasn't because he was lucky. It was because his liver was the hardest working organ in the American West. The Wild West wasn't won on horseback. It was survived, one toxic shot at a time. And the fact that anyone survived at all is a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human body when it decides that getting drunk is more important than staying healthy. So we raise a glass of your clean, regulated, FDA-approved whiskey and pour one out for the Cowboys. Not because they were heroes, but because they drank poison and asked for a refill. That is a level of commitment to bad decisions that you have to respect, even if it makes you sick to your stomach.